Good afternoon and welcome to the launch of the third edition of the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor, which is a joint initiative of NewClimate Institute and Carbon Market Watch. Now, it's a third edition, but that doesn't mean it's merely a repeat exercise of the first and second editions. It presents really fresh, in-depth analysis of 20 companies across four focus sectors. However, this CCRM still takes the companies analyzed in the previous editions into account in its aggregate analysis. So it's able, based on the analysis altogether of 51 companies, to focus on the primordial short-term climate action through the analysis of corporate 2030 targets. What's also special about this third edition is that it embeds in the context of important developments, both in the field of voluntary regulation as well as government regulation. It takes issue, for example, with the current lobbying for more flexibility in voluntary initiatives like SBTi, where the use of carbon credits to cover Scope 3 emissions is being promoted. And with regard to government regulation, the CCRM presents the EU's Green Claims Directive negotiations as a promising scene for acting against corporate greenwashing. But to tell you much more about all of this, we have two of the CCRM authors with us, Tom Day from NewClimate Institute and Silke Moldijk, as well as Gilles Dufresne from Carbon Market Watch. They will be followed by a panel of three who will give you snapshots, and that's to be understood literally, of three initiatives that closely relate to the subject matter of the CCRM and widen the context yet a bit more. As you listen to all these distinguished people, please submit your questions in the Q&A of the Zoom. We have colleagues at the ready who will pick out those that we can answer, and we will do as best as we can with the time we have available. And with this, it's straight over to Tom and Sybrig to, my goodness, I said it, I didn't introduce Sybrig properly because there's been a change. It's Sybrig Smit, who is the second author of the CCRM, who will present the findings. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Sabine, and thanks even more so to everybody there giving your time to listen to us and to join us to talk about this today. We really appreciate the opportunity to share what we've found and some of the good news and the more concerning things that we found with you today. So thank you very much. At a glance, this is what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. We're seeing some signs of improvement in companies' targets, but across the board, we still see they're critically insufficient. And even these improvements come with some important, very significant caveats. One, that when we look into companies' measures and the transition plans, the mixed progress on these transition plans really undermines some of these targets, calls into question their credibility. And also, as Sabine mentioned, we see quite some issues with the proposals that are being put on the table to introduce flexibility into targets, and we find they even nullify the commitments. And so altogether, we see this is an extremely important year, or 2024 and 2025, for taking the opportunity of the GHG protocol revision and the SBTi net zero standard revision and the ISO standard development process to really fix some of the issues that are there and to make sure that we don't create any additional loopholes. So I'm going to dive in, take a step back and explain a bit what exactly we've done. We look at the transparency and integrity of the strategies that companies put forward. So we look at these two things independently. Transparency refers to the extent to which we understand what companies are communicating, and integrity, whether or not they're really sufficient and aligned with 1.5 pathways. And it's a relatively small sample we look at. For each report in the past, we've looked at 20-25 companies. Now this analysis includes 51 from all 3 of the years that we've conducted this exercise. And the point is, instead of compared to some other studies that are looking at a much larger set of companies, we're really trying to drill in much greater detail on a handful of case studies. We're actually spending a couple of weeks, sometimes more, on each company case, really looking into the nuances of everything we find in order to thoroughly understand what it is that we're looking at. What does the company strategy really mean? And so these are the companies we're looking at. The objective of the exercise is not to target the companies themselves. It's really important to stress. What we're trying to do is trying to understand, are today's approaches to governing corporate climate action working or not? And to do that, we need to look at these case studies and dissect them and take them apart. These major companies are really relevant to look at. We're often asked, why do we focus on them? Are we looking at the tip of the iceberg? It's really important to look at these biggest companies in the world. They're the ones that are actually required to take climate action by their investors, if not regulators. They influence government policy. They actually play a big role in writing the rule books themselves by being part of the standard development process, and they set the example for other companies. So it's really important, for the sake of getting it right for the other hundreds of thousands of companies out there, that we make sure we're getting it right for these biggest companies in the world, and that's why we're looking at them. So what do their targets actually mean? The next charts on the next couple of slides that I'm going to show you, they all follow a similar format. So here what you see is just one axis, an x-axis, which shows from 0 to 100% what the company is actually committing to reduce in terms of the percentage of their full GHG emission footprint. And this is for their net zero targets for whatever year they formulate their net zero targets to be. So what we see here is that quite a lot of companies are actually over to the right-hand side of the chart, gravitating around the 90% position. And about the other half of companies are over on the left-hand side of the chart, either committing to something much less, or actually having quite ambiguous targets where it's not clear where we could put them on the chart whatsoever. This represents quite an improvement compared to the exercise, a similar exercise we did 2 years ago, where we found that the vast majority of companies were over on the left-hand side here, and that their net zero targets were not substantiated in any way, and we couldn't determine for most of them what the emission reduction commitment is. We now see that this is really improving for a lot of companies. And I think this reflects the convergence that we've seen in the last 1 or 2 years across the standards, which really require that net zero actually means a commitment to deep decarbonization. Still, it's concerning that there is this big split. There are companies that are doing this well, and there are companies, by the voluntary nature of these standards, that just don't do it, and that are on the left-hand side. So that shows there are improvements happening, but that we can't necessarily rely on voluntary standards to get us the full way here. For 2030, the picture it's less polarized. I think there's quite a spread though of what we see. So we see quite some companies on the left-hand side here. So on the green lines that you see are what we would need across the global level, cross-sector, to be aligned with 1.5 pathways. The red line here is the median, and it's also the mean average as well this year. It's the same commitment that we see across the 51 companies. So the majority of companies are quite short of where they need to be. Generally, actually, though, this is quite an improvement as well from previous years, where we've been looking around the 20-25% mark, although the sample sizes in previous years were not perfectly comparable. There's definitely an improvement to be seen here. One issue, or one big question mark here, is whether this is really a significant improvement, or whether there are potential accounting loopholes that are contributing towards this. And this is a little bit what I want to highlight now with the 2 caveats that we've seen. So one caveat, which Sybrig is going to go into in a bit more detail, is that the targets are often not substantiated by real transition plans. So in this table, you see 8 companies that we've looked at where we've said, okay, actually their targets are where they should be. They're either of high integrity or reasonable integrity, but only for a small group of these companies are their targets also substantiated by measures that will take them there. For other companies, especially for several agri-food companies and for companies in the fashion sector, we see much more of a discrepancy, and this really undermines or questions what the target means. And then taking this back to this slide, that raises a bit of a question mark about the improvement that we're seeing and the 30% average, because this 30% has really been pulled up by some quite strong sounding targets by some of these companies, and especially the fashion companies, which are clustered here, having quite strong sounding targets, but it's really not clear what these targets mean, or if they will be achieved through other means, through more creative accounting loopholes, in which case this 30% might not be as good news as it currently appears. The second caveat here relates to developments that we're seeing that are not yet reflected in the standards, but where we have concerns what might lie ahead, and in particular the role of offsetting, and the VCMI beta scope 3 flexibility claim in particular. We understand at the moment that there's quite a degree of pressure for this to be integrated as a mechanism for companies to implement their targets, or to claim that they have bridged the gap to implementing their targets. And due to the extent of pressure that we perceive, we decided to analyze this a little bit and run scenarios of what would happen if this would actually become the standard for companies. And the flexibility claim is a 50% flexibility claim, but what's important to understand here is that it does not require companies to achieve 50% of their targets and offset the rest. It rather allows them to offset 50% of their full emissions footprint in the target year to claim to have bridged the gap to their target in that year. Or to turn it on their head, it allows them to double their emissions in the target year, which for most companies means that they would be able to increase their emissions between now and 2030 and still be eligible to claim that they've bridged the gap to their emission reduction target. And the chart here at the bottom demonstrates this. This comes directly from the source document of the VCMI Scope 3 flexibility document, showing that this company, which is increasing its emissions, would still be eligible for this claim because it's within double of their emissions in the target year. This chart shows what would happen if all companies would actually make maximum use of this flexibility mechanism, and that's not our hypothesis. Of course, this is an extreme case. We don't expect suddenly that every company would give up entirely on its emission reduction commitments, but we're showing here basically this is what companies would now be on the hook for. So they wouldn't, if I take the example of H&M here, in the starting position without the VCMI claim, then they are committed to reduce about 50%, 56% of their value chain emissions by 2030. If they were to make full use of the flexibility mechanism proposed, then this would take them all the way back to around 16, 17%, which for most companies here only relates to their scope 1 and 2 emissions, because the flexibility mechanism would basically allow them to increase their scope 3 emissions and would nullify their scope 3 emission target to all extents and purposes. Again, this is not our expectation for what companies would actually do, but we're highlighting the fact that this is the allowance it would give them. And in our view, this is far too blunt a mechanism to deal with the challenges that companies are facing on their indirect emissions. One other thing we've done is to look at how the assessments compare across the various voluntary initiatives, and we see quite some inconsistencies between the voluntary initiatives or the various independent assessments on how they consider companies' targets. In particular, we perceive quite a degree of leniency already existing on the SBTi targets, where, as the chart here shows, for the fashion and the food and agriculture sector as examples, the ratings there, as we see them, contain significantly less nuance than the ratings of some other agencies. And there are there are important reasons why this is the case and why this has come about, which we could discuss in more detail. I think the key takeaway message from this, though, is to see that there's already quite a degree of leniency in there, and there's not really a strong case for further watering down standards with unnuanced flexibility mechanisms. But the first caveat I talked about was the transition plans that are potentially calling into question the credibility of targets. And for that, I would hand over to my colleague Sybrig.
Thank you, Tom. Indeed. With those aggregate results in mind, I would now jump into a little bit of sectoral results. So first of all, we see that some companies are starting to implement the measures that are necessary for transitional change. Among the electric utilities and automobile manufacturers, we found a few leading examples, but also in these sectors, there are companies who are still lagging behind. For electric utilities, it is very clear what they should do, namely ramp up renewables and, of course, phase out all fossil fuels. With regards to renewable electricity, Iberdrola and Enel already both have relatively high share of installed renewable capacity today, and are also planning to increase this further until 2030. And when looking at the complete phase out of all fossil fuels, we find that Enel is the only company with a comprehensive plan to phase out coal and fossil gas. For the automobile manufacturers, there are also two important measures that we need to see. First of all, phase out vehicles with internal combustion engines and replace them with electric vehicles. And secondly, switch to low carbon steel and aluminium that they use to produce their cars and low carbon batteries for electric vehicles. We found that all companies plan to increase their sales share of electric vehicles, but these plans are generally not at the pace that is necessary for the automobile sector to be aligned with a 1.5 aligned trajectory. Volvo Group, which produces heavy-duty vehicles and should not be confused with Volvo Cars, the passenger cars, is the only company to implement both of these measures. So both the phasing out of internal combustion engines, as well as switching to low-carbon steel, aluminium, and low-carbon batteries. Then moving to the fashion sector. This is the sector where we identified several relatively ambitious targets, but the implementation gap in this sector is perhaps one of the clearest. Tom touched upon it. By implementation gap, we mean the mismatch between ambitious targets and the lack of a credible set of measures. So the ambition is high, but the plans are not so convincing. This high ambition that we find in the sector is undermined by plans for bioenergy and renewable electricity certificates. Bioenergy is not an emissions-free source. This means cutting down trees and plants to burn them for energy, and this means a re-release of carbon into the atmosphere. Moreover, it competes with food production and can harm biodiversity or lead to deforestation. And these RECs, or renewable energy certificates, oftentimes do not translate to additional renewable capacity on the grid, and they can lead to double counting of the renewable electricity consumption. So what do we not see in this sector? Three critical measures. First of all, the companies do not plan to transition away from their fast fashion models. They simply aim for high targets with business as usual. They do not commit sufficiently to recycling of textiles. Rather, they tend to mislead consumers with recycling claims with regards to PET, for example, which keeps the demand for virgin plastic quite high. Maybe you all have seen these labels on clothes that say made from recycled bottles. Well, these bottles can then not be used again in the beverage industry. And we see limited to no signs of electrification in the manufacturing processes. And this is closely related to the bioenergy, where bioenergy is used to replace the coal use for heat, and not no electrification of the manufacturing processes. Then finally, the agriculture and food sector. In this sector, some companies are starting to explore the transitional pathway that is necessary for the sector. The main issue for the agri-food sector are the great volumes of methane emissions, of course, mainly from livestock. Methane emissions need to decline rapidly, and the most important and crucial measure for this is the shift to more plant-based protein. Only one company in our agri-food sample pledges to reduce methane emissions, and this is Danone. And for Danone, this pledge is backed up by a plan to significantly increase the share of plant-based products in its annual revenue. We interpreted this plan to go hand in hand with a reduction in dairy production. Another crucial issue in the agricultural and food sector is that at least 2 companies in our sample are counting land sequestration, carbon dioxide removal towards emission reductions. We acknowledge that enhanced CDR is crucial to reach global net zero emissions, but it of course should not replace emission reductions. Also in the agri-food sector, emissions need to decrease significantly alongside enhanced land sequestration CDR. Land sequestration CDR is associated with a low degree of permanence, meaning it has a high chance of carbon being re-emitted into the atmosphere. And also there's a high uncertainty of how much carbon can actually be stored. For Danone and Mars, as shown in the table on the screen, we understand that their plans for CDR are additional to emission reduction targets. But for Nestle and Tesco, the role of CDR for target realization remains undefined. And with this overview of our results of the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor 2024, Gilles from Carbon Market Watch will now elaborate on the key policy implications of this all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sybrig, and hello to everyone. So as Sybrig said, I will try to connect these findings and these analysis to the current landscape around regulation, both from a government perspective and what kind of policies are put in place to regulate these sorts of voluntary initiatives, but also talking briefly about what is happening at the level of the various voluntary initiatives. So focusing first on government regulation, of course, we all know that there are quite a range of policies all around the world to get various sectors and companies to decarbonize, for example, the European emissions trading systems or other policies. But here, what is much more relevant in the context of the CCRM is to talk about the policies that might have an impact on voluntary initiatives and voluntary targets that companies are taking, because all of the targets that are analyzed in this report are voluntarily set by the companies, and that's also part of the issue. In that context, most of the policies and regulations focus on transparency, communications, reporting of emissions, and they're one of the most burning negotiations in that sphere at the moment, at the European level at least, is the question of protecting consumers and avoiding greenwashing from companies. That is a discussion that's happening within the negotiations around the Green Claims Directive, which is currently being negotiated between the European Parliament and the Council. The main element there is to try to curb the wave of greenwashing that we have seen over the past years. And one of the pieces that is most relevant for the findings of the CCRM is the question of how this tackles the use of carbon credits within companies' targets and plans. The EU already agreed on a ban on carbon neutral advertisements for products and services. That was agreed as part of a separate legislative process, which was concluded last year, and which does ban all carbon neutral advertisements for products and services. One of the questions in the Green Claims Directive is whether or not that ban would extend to company level claims. In our view, it is not logical to say that a carbon neutral product is misleading for consumers, but that companies can advertise themselves as carbon neutral companies. So for consistency and from a logical point of view, it would make sense to extend the carbon neutrality advertisement ban to company level claims. We also think it's really important to ensure that a whole range of compensation claims are covered and not just limiting it to the very specific term of offsetting, because we have seen over the various iterations of the CCRM that the narrative around the use of external emission reductions or compensation is changing, especially in the agriculture and food sector, where what used to be called insetting is very prevalent, and now that terminology is shifting again a little bit. But the idea is always the same. It's the idea that a company is announcing a target that sounds ambitious, but in reality is actually not delivering a lot of internal emission reductions and banking either on external reductions or on removals within the value chain that come with similar challenges when it comes to kind of accounting and just checking that companies are delivering on what they said they would be delivering. So that's one main piece of legislation that's being negotiated at the moment. Of course, there are other pieces. If we look, for example, at the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is being implemented now and is somewhat a more business-to-business focused regulation requiring companies to disclose a lot of information, which, although accessible to consumers, tends to be quite technical, and therefore it's more directed towards shareholders and business partners. There, it is good practice, as required by the CSRD, to ensure that companies will report their full emissions, including their indirect emissions. And that's actually something that is quite controversial outside of the EU, and in particular in the US at the moment, where disclosure requirements are being set up and the subject of a lot of political discussions. And it is quite concerning to see that there still fails to be enough political support on even just disclosing the full impact of companies' emissions. And so that's something where we really hope to see a lot of improvement, because transparency around that is really just the starting point of having better information and hence better action. Now, turning to the voluntary initiatives that we also see evolving in this space, there are, of course, quite a lot of different initiatives. I chose to flag 3 here: the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. The reason why I focused on this is because, as Tom was saying at the beginning of the presentation, one of the sort of hot debates at the moment is the question of whether and how carbon credits might be used as part of companies' climate strategies, and in particular, what's the role of carbon credits in meeting Scope 3 targets. And there, what we are witnessing now, and we have been seeing over the past couple of months at least, is really a very extreme push and just outright lobbying. I think it's difficult to call it anything else that the Science-Based Targets Initiative is being subject to by a lot of private companies and voluntary carbon market actors, putting pressure on SBTi to weaken its existing rules and to include provisions that would allow companies to meet Scope 3 targets with carbon credits. In our view, that's a hugely concerning development. We strongly call on SBTi to maintain its current rules with respect to the rule of carbon credits, which is that carbon credits should not count towards meeting internal emission reductions and delivering on science-based targets. And we do see a major risk in dismantling the mitigation hierarchy by allowing companies to use credits for Scope 3, because Scope 3, for the vast majority of companies, represents the vast majority of their emissions. So Tom showed some numbers and analysis about what the risks might be if some of the flexibility frameworks that are out there might get adopted and endorsed by SBTi, and we really see that would be quite a challenging situation for climate action. Similar discussions are happening within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. I'm not going to go into too much details on those to make sure we have enough time for everyone to talk. So just one last concluding point is that throughout the analysis that has been done for the CCRM, not just this one, but also the 2 previous analyses and all of the work that we're all doing, and I'm sure many in the audience are also doing, looking at corporate climate action, we did come to the realization that ultimately voluntary action, even well-intentioned and ambitious, is just highly unlikely to deliver the action that we need at the scale that we need it. And that one of the most impactful actions that companies can take, that true climate leaders can take, if not the most impactful action, is to support change and climate action within an entire sector and economy-wide policies. And this can be done by supporting sectoral initiatives within industry bodies, for example, but also, and most importantly, by supporting governments in adopting regulations that would set binding requirements for an entire sector to move. While we support and we encourage companies to set science-based targets and to deliver on those targets, have real plans to meet those targets, we also see that it will just not be enough if we have a handful of companies that deliver emission reductions, especially in the context of voluntary initiatives that just sometimes don't have the rules that are necessary to really be on a trajectory to meet the 1.5 degree of the Paris Agreement. And so we really see the need for further regulation and for companies to support regulation, to use their voice to make clear that this is what's really needed in the long term. So I will leave it at that, and I will pass it back to Sabine to moderate some of the next comments.
Thanks a lot, Tom, Sybrig, and Gilles, for starting us off with these presentations. We now move to the second set of the presentations, where we will hear snapshots of pieces of work that happen in the same context, happen with the same overall thrust and intention. And the first one is by Alexis McGivern, who is Net Zero Integrity Manager at University of Oxford, who will talk about some recent findings on net zero regulation and policies. Alexis, the challenge is 3 minutes. You might get the chance to elaborate further in the Q&A. Let's see whether you can do that.
Thanks so much, Sabine. And I'm really delighted that the CCRM has been launched today. It's a really useful tool for us because transparency and accountability help us to identify loopholes to make sure that we're doing credible climate action. So Gilles has already set me up very well to explain why regulation is so important. Of course, that regulation is less readily reversible than voluntary commitments, which promotes certainty, especially in the investment environment. Secondly, that a regulation allows for a level playing field, especially that we need to be shifting the political economy and sector-wide transformation. So we need to push for general rules that apply to everyone, not just leaders. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, that mandatory rules can be enforced legally, while voluntary systems rely on, public scrutiny like the CCRM does, and damages to reputational risk, damages to reputation and that risk in order to drive action. So I represent a coalition of about 30 researchers here at Oxford, an interdisciplinary research group that does lots of analysis on how we get to net zero safely, credibly, and equitably. And we did a snapshot of regulation across the G20, tracking around 400 regulatory instruments across disclosure, transition plans, claims, as Gilles was just speaking about, procurement and product standards. And I'll just share 2 key findings. The first is that the number of regulatory instruments related to net zero has grown tenfold in the G20 since the signing of the Paris Agreement 9 years ago. So we are seeing a massive increase in the number of regulatory instruments, and just across those 5 domains that I mentioned. So disclosure, transition plans, claims, procurement, and product standards. So there's a large increase in regulation. And that is the second finding, is that is across developed and developing countries and across different levels of ambition. So we're seeing different kinds of regulatory instruments, some very high ambitions, some just kind of removing some of the red tape. One message that I want to emphasize is that regulation for net zero is both adding regulation, like the instruments that I mentioned, but also removing regulation that is no longer serving us when it comes to climate action. So some of this analysis was just published hot off the press this morning in Nature Climate Change. And one of the examples we use there is the attack on climate action, arguing that it would violate antitrust regulations, which are there, of course, to protect consumers from corporate collusion. And the response to that from the regulatory side in the Netherlands and in the UK is that competition authorities in both of those countries have adopted guidelines that basically exempt voluntary sustainability coalitions, which are so important to reduce greenhouse gases. They're exempt from competition laws. So making sure that regulation is also serving to remove any barriers. And so what we need is, of course, coherence across domains and across jurisdictions. Gilles spoke about the SEC challenges. So, for example, in the US, the disclosure requirements in California are different to the ones adopted by the US securities regulator. So we need to make sure that there's alignments across jurisdictions. And also it's important to recognize that there is no one size fits all for net zero regulation. Local contexts are incredibly important. And so different strategies will be different across countries. But we need to have the scientific guardrails that encompass all of those. And of course, finally, we know that there's important questions about fairness when it comes to, a fair distribution of an emissions budget, and especially how it works when a firm is operating across multiple jurisdictions, how they should be regulated. And obviously there are differences in a government's capacity to develop and enforce regulation. So there are important differences there. But at Oxford, we're working on tracking that regulation, understanding the landscape, and identifying best practice in net zero regulation that can be more widely disseminated.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I call this putting things into a nutshell wonderful, but nobody is invited here to break the speaking record. You haven't done this. I'm just saying this as a precaution to the next speakers. Guillaume Beaune, it's over to you. Guillaume Beaune, Advocacy Officer at WWF, who is going to talk a bit about WWF's corporate targets work. Guillaume, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So we've been working on transition plans, targets, and verification systems regarding climate and nature transition plans. And so the report we published about targets came a month ago and is the first of a series we'll be publishing on this topic. We had 3 goals for the report, which was 1, to identify all the regulatory requirements for target setting in the EU. 2, to provide methodological recommendations for ambitious and credible target setting. And 3, to recommend tools to facilitate compliance with legal obligations for companies. So the key takeaways we had from this report was 1, that CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, requires companies to set targets on all 3 scopes of carbon emissions, disclose whether they're aligned with 1.5 degrees, and describe how and what scenarios were used to set the targets. Targets also have to be set at 5-year intervals between 2030 and 2050 minimum in absolute values, and offsets should be reported separately. So you're allowed low residual emissions on a net zero basis, but you shouldn't be using offsets to really implement your targets in CSRD regulation. Then the other recommendations we had were around the tools analysis that we performed. So we really looked into SBTI quite a lot, as it's the gold standard for target setting in the market today. And what we saw very broadly is that it does answer the requirement to be 1.5 degree aligned and provides external validation for targets that are produced by companies. It's important here to note that SBTI doesn't validate transition plans or the action plans put behind the targets, but solely the alignment of the target with a 1.5 degree pathway, which also explains some of the differences that can be seen in different rating agencies and scores. Another conclusion from the report is that the requirements from SBTI help to comply and sometimes exceed regulatory requirements. And so in the end, our recommendation is that SBTI helps to facilitate target setting for companies, with 2 little caveats. The first one is that there is a definite need to maintain the current level of ambition and robustness of the tool itself and of the method for target setting, so as to stay compliant with at least EU regulation in the short to medium term. And again, it's important to emphasize that targets alone aren't enough to really implement your transition plan. So these should be accompanied by transition planning efforts to provide credibility to the claims that are being made on the targets, and ideally with measurement, reporting, verification systems, so that it's easier for information users, regulators, etc., to really follow what's being done concretely inside the companies to reach their objectives. And I think I'll stop it for here and give it back to you, Sabine.
Thanks a lot, Guillaume. These are recommendations that come with a great deal of authority, of historical work. The next snapshot is by Johnny White, who is a lawyer with Client Earth, who will give us a few insights into the case against KLM.
Thank you very much, Sabine, and hello, everyone. So people have spoken about regulation and people have spoken about voluntary standards being two pillars of governance in this space. The other pillar of governance in this space that is increasingly becoming relevant to actors is basically the action that judges and that regulators take. And the reason I mention that is also because that doesn't depend on new regulation coming in. The reason for that is that we have legal guardrails governing truth in commerce in our societies already, which is to say that misleading statements when they're made to consumers or to investors are prohibited under European and national laws, including outside Europe all over the world. So the KLM case is an example of how those laws apply to transition plans and to statements made around targets for net zero plans. So this is a case that was in the Netherlands, was brought against the airline KLM by a climate NGO, and Client Earth, which is a legal environmental NGO, supported the case. So I'm just going to cover briefly 3 points that came out of the judgment. The judgment was handed down at the end of March, so very recently. And I believe it's the first greenwashing judgment on net zero claims on Paris alignment that exists globally. And so it's quite significant. It's certainly been attracting a lot of commentary in the legal press and in the general press. So the 3 things that I'm going to pull out from it. First of all, the court found that the statements regarding offsetting basically were misleading and unlawful. The court found that there is no substantiation to drawing a direct link between a customer contribution to, in this case, reforestation schemes and the impact of the flight. So drawing that direct link was impermissible. So the first thing is basically that the court intervened with existing general laws to stop claims about offsetting. The second thing is that the court found that the statements that the airline was making in its public advertising about being committed to the Paris goal meant just that. So in other words, the court said, the rough translation is something like, the statement about being committed to Paris can mean nothing other than that KLM's targets are aligned with the Paris goal. And that point was fought very hard by the company, which tried to suggest that this was merely a subjective, aspirational statement that it was making, but the court disagreed. And the third point, to Guillaume's point, that it's not just targets that matter, is that the court also looked at the measures underlying the target and found them to be, in short, too marginal, too limited, too speculative to back up the public advertising claims. It looked at things like biofuels and their very limited scope. It looked at things like e-fuels and the fact that there was no reason to know that they would ever be supplied at a commercial scale. And it looked, in short, not in exhaustive detail, but into the actual sufficiency of the measures. And so all of that is basically to say something that we've been saying for quite a long time, which is that these claims and these statements that are made around transition and made around aligning with the Paris goal will attract legal risk where they are not substantiated. And one final thing I'll mention, just as the dying seconds of my slot, is to underline that this is not just an issue of NGO litigation. What we're seeing now is that competitors are also taking up these legal challenges, and it's a general issue of legal compliance. And that's something that I think we're going to see a lot more of as consumers, as competitors, as different sectors start to use the law and these guardrails to enforce against these issues. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. This is all very rich material, and kudos already to those who were in parallel able to formulate intelligent questions, and I will start off with some of them. A first question by Joe Walton, and I think it would be suitable for Gilles to answer it. The question is, in terms of policy, to what extent are there trade-offs between alignment or standardization on the one hand and allowing certain sectors of jurisdiction to show leadership and race ahead of the pack?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think this is actually where we see the distinction between the role for government regulation and the role for voluntary initiatives and voluntary action, in the sense that we very much see the need for government regulation, as we've mentioned before, essentially to work as a sort of floor to create that level playing field. And don't get me wrong, like the floor needs to be quite high. It needs to be a Paris compatible floor, and ensure that there is sector-wide action or economy-wide action. And at the same time, allowing and incentivizing some of the leaders that want to go beyond what's the minimum floor set by governments is the role of voluntary initiatives. And that also is the sort of rationale for why we're calling for voluntary initiatives to adopt a high bar, to set a high bar, to have very ambitious rules, because that is basically the role that these voluntary initiatives can play. It's in ensuring that we distinguish which companies are the true climate leaders from those that are delivering the bare minimum. But the bare minimum needs to be something. We can't assume that the alternative to high ambition voluntary action is just nothing. And that's why we need government action to ensure that this alternative is not nothing.
Okay, thank you. We have a second question which goes into a similar direction. It is by Owen Bethel, and I think, Guillaume, you would be well placed to answer it. The question is, given the political direction of travel and in the EU and elsewhere, how realistic is it to call for regulation of net zero targets? Should we not rather encourage voluntary action rather than criticize it? Of course, there's a particular viewpoint here entailed in this question, but Guillaume, I'm sure you can reckon with that.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I'm thinking also Alexis might have something to say about that right afterwards. Basically, the idea, right, is to, at least in our vision, to work on both legs at the same time. So at the same time, pushing for stronger regulation. And, you know, we are seeing some evolution in that field. I mean, in the EU, we're seeing the Green Deal articulate a number of texts around the ambition of the EU to become net zero by 2050, to diminish its share of emissions by 2030. And so there's a number of accompanying regulations that are going to help and incentivize companies to get to net zero, whether it's through target setting, transition planning, etc. So there's real necessity to make sure that these regulations are meaningful and that they also give credibility to the claims that are being put forward. And at the same time, on an international level, and for companies that aren't necessarily taken into regulatory scopes, it's important that the voluntary standards that they adhere to are sufficient in their ambition that they can really fill the gap for whoever may not be covered. And then I'll give it over to Alexis to complete.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll just say on the Oxford side, the way that we look at it is as this conveyor belt, that voluntary initiatives are really important for generating good criteria, good action, and can have a groundswell of activity, and that those get further formalized into standards, and then that gets further formalized into regulation. And so we work across all pieces of that conveyor belt, but that regulation is sort of the gold standard in our eyes. And just to say, there is a lot of cross-pollination between these. So as I mentioned, the 400 regulatory instruments that we mapped, of that, around half of those had directly cited a voluntary instrument. So just under half had cited a voluntary initiative as the basis for their regulation. And so there is quite a lot of cross-pollination between those. And I know Johnny had a point as well, so I'll hand over to him.
Just very quickly, yeah, I think it's an interesting question because it sort of assumes, perhaps unintentionally, that there's no kind of regulation of net zero prior to specific net zero regulation. And that's not actually the case. So what I see this more as is a sort of level playing field or legal clarity issue. Previously, if I was advising a company, I might have said, watch out, you might fall foul of these general laws. With regulation, you can say, these are the specific things you have to do. And so it allows greater granularity on that basis. So yeah, the underlying market dynamics are still there, and I think that's the key thing that drives a lot of this.
Okay, thanks a lot. Moving on to a further question which relates to SBTI. It might be Guillaume again who answers it, or somebody from NewClimate. Let's see. It's somebody who purports not to be very familiar with SBTI, who asks, could you explain how it fits into the wider landscape of reporting legislation and standards? And the reference here is to both US and EU corporate disclosure legislation.
Yeah, happy to take this one. So I think the question also really links back to the one we just answered. Basically, SBTI isn't directly related to the regulations, right? It's got, however, heavy bridges with regulations, notably in the EU. So there is, I think, one direct reference to SBTI in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that kind of gives the minimum rates of decarbonation given by SBTI as a reference for the minimum rates of decarbonization expected from companies in the EU. And then so there's been quite a few contacts made between regulators, supervisors, and SBTI when they were coming up with the standards, because there is a methodology in place for rating targets according to different climate scenarios. So that's one of the links that exists. Another one that's important to make is that while it's a voluntary initiative, SBTI is also a methodology and a tool that helps companies to implement the targets. And so while there's no direct relationship, there is also the ability that SBTI has to facilitate the exercise for companies. So it's important that the requirements in the tool also kind of always comply with or exceed the regulatory requirements, which it's done so far. But so there's a real importance for that to keep being the case. And then maybe one last thing, compared with other voluntary standards. So I saw GHG protocol mentioned. Well, target setting requires proper carbon accounting. And so there are direct references, for example, in SBTI to GHG protocol or ISO methodologies for carbon accounting. And so this is how all of these different frameworks, voluntary initiatives, and regulations communicate.
Right, I think that's a great answer. The next one, I think that's one for you, Tom. It's still on SBTI, but with a specific question of how the use of carbon credits for Scope 3 might come in under the SBTI framework. And you might want to use this question to expand further and maybe go back to this proposed Scope 3 flexibility issue again.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sabine. So I think how exactly it would fit in is still completely up to speculation. Obviously, we see the VCMI Scope 3 flexibility proposal. It still has a lot of gaps and question marks, but a lot of the questions about how this could or should fit into any of the voluntary standards, including SBTI, happen behind closed doors at the moment, and it remains quite up in the air, I think. One concrete suggestion that we hear quite often is to simply completely remove from SBTI the function of deciding what counts towards target fulfillment. So to say that SBTI is an organization that says what targets companies should set in terms of a certain percentage, and it's up to someone else completely to decide then what counts towards those targets. And that's quite we find that quite a disingenuous approach in the sense that targets or standards don't really mean anything at all if you don't say what counts towards the target. So I'm not sure if that's really an honest proposal, to be honest. I think it's really important because where is this pressure coming from? And I think we see two reasons. On the one hand, there's clearly a need to and a wish and a need to improve the flow of finance to projects in developing countries, and this is clearly something that we need to find ways to address. The beyond value chain mitigation approach from SBTI is a really good step in the right direction for this. I think the other challenge or the source of pressure is from companies in addressing the challenges that they understandably face in addressing indirect Scope 3 emissions. It's not an easy task to have a flat GHG emission reduction target across your entire value chain and to address this. But again, we think there are other ways that this could be addressed without a blunt offsetting mechanism. We could, for example, take this opportunity that we have this year with the revision of the GHG protocol and with the revision of the SBTi net zero standard to have a little bit of a rethink about how Scope 3 target setting actually happens, and if it might be possible to be a bit more specific about focusing on specific emission sources that really matter for each sector and making sure that that there's much less flexibility and much more specificity on what companies need to do in these areas. And I think that's actually something that could help companies to focus their efforts and address some of those concerns that we hear without just a blunt offsetting mechanism nullifying the targets, which would actually erase so much of the progress that we've made and that companies have made over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a call for action. A next question, it might be suitable for Guillaume, it might also be suitable for Gilles. It relates to the policy making arena, and is the question, what are your expectations, what the EU might come up with in terms of providing guidance for corporate climate transition plans? And what would be key from your perspective for this role that a regulator might perform? Guillaume, do you want to have a first stab, and then Gilles, you join in?
Sure. Thank you very much. So the couple of things that right now we've identified as priorities at the EU level and that are being discussed at that level too are implementation guidance, because, you know, transition planning can be a little bit of a daunting exercise if you've never been confronted with it. It requires a lot of different know-hows and communication between a lot of different departments, stakeholders, etc., to be really meaningful, credible, and ambitious. And so there is going to be priority given to implementation guidances. So more process-oriented, maybe on how you build a transition plan rather than just what you have to disclose within it. And then the other area of priority that has been identified is also a clarification of the articulation of different regulations together around transition planning, because there's maybe 5, 6 different legal pieces that touch down on this concept in the EU framework. And so there has been an identified need to kind of explain how all of these fit together and communicate. Those are the 2 things that right now we've seen kind of emerge as priorities on the European side.
Gilles, would you like to add something?
Just like a short point kind of connected to this, even though it's not formally the same processes, but I think the question of residual emissions and how residual emissions are defined and characterized within a range of policies as well as in voluntary action is something that is increasingly becoming a priority, and where the EU could be playing a role. There is some work around that's undertaken as part of the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It also comes into the debate around the Green Claims Directive, and it ends up being a fundamental challenge to really understand how a given company or a given sector can identify what its remaining or residual emissions might be at a given point in time, and in particular, really understanding that residual is not a sort of static state, and that residual emissions will change over time. And the goal really should be that whatever is unabatable today, what is residual today, will become abatable tomorrow, and to continuously push that sort of decarbonization frontier.
Thanks a lot. We have 1 minute left, but I dare to take one last question. Johnny, I think you are well placed to answer it. It is, does your work look at climate-related financial disclosures, and do you see laws on impairment being important in this space?
Yes. So we haven't discussed much of the why for transition plans today, looking at the content of them, but one of the whys of transition plans is to have a viable, even thriving business in 2040. And that is what transition climate financial related risk looks like. And it's also to be in a world where you are able to have a thriving business. And that's the systemic risk element that all businesses face. Impairments of assets is a clear example of transition risk, particularly for example, the oil and gas sector. Organizations like Carbon Tracker have done excellent work digging into what that really means. But that is clearly where you see these sorts of disclosures and claims interacting with investors, investor risk, investor loss, and therefore potentially also investor claims and litigation.
Super, thank you. Well, this is where I must close it. Thank you very much to all the panelists for their presentations. And thanks also to those who have worked behind the scenes to make this possible, and of course to all the participants that we have had today. Let me say that all the work that has been presented today is a resource for you, the audience, to work with further. We have not done this just to please ourselves. We're really putting this out there for you to work with these results, whether you are a company representative, a government representative, whether you are from NGOs, funders, or service providers in the climate field. I know we have had representatives of all those in the audience today. Please make the best possible use of the resources that are now in the public domain with this launch today. Good luck to all of you, and bye-bye for today.